Shalanda Young in a heated showdown over a hidden federal policy that charges government workers $7 a month just to drink water. Shalanda tries to defend it as a budget-saving measure, but within minutes, Jasmine flips the entire hearing with undeniable proof, shocking testimony, and a single bottle held high. Now the nation watches in disbelief, because if public servants have to pay to stay hydrated, what else are we quietly being charged to survive? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. Monday, 8:47 a.m. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as paralegals shuffled case files and prosecutors prepared for a backlogged morning of arraignments. The air inside the U.S. Attorney's office felt heavy, unusually still. The water coolers stood empty, silent, skeletal reminders of a promise unkept. For the third week in a row, no bottled water had arrived. A generic email lit up inboxes like a bad joke. Please remain patient. Delivery delays continue. Thank you for understanding. At her desk near the far wall, Layla Flores, a 26-year-old legal assistant fresh out of Howard Law, looked up from a folder on her desk, her lips cracked and dry. She whispered to the woman beside her, "I pay $7 every month for this, and I'm still thirsty." The words hung between them like a confession. She wasn't alone. Around the room, others were muttering, side-eyeing the abandoned water dispensers, checking their phones for updates. None came. Tension pulsed beneath the quiet, like the moment before a storm. By noon, the rumor had a name. Water Club. Not a joke, not a typo. A real policy, $7 deducted from paychecks in exchange for access to basic hydration. Only those who opted in were promised water. Only those who paid would be hydrated. Except now, even that promise had evaporated. The idea that government attorneys and their teams, some of the most vital pillars of public justice, had to pay to drink hit the office like a slap. It didn't take long for the first ripple to hit the Capitol. Jasmine Crockett, firebrand congresswoman from Texas, known for treating hearings like battlegrounds and bureaucratic hypocrisy like live targets, caught wind of the scandal within hours. She didn't wait for confirmation. She didn't schedule a meeting. She walked straight into her office, eyes blazing, and tweeted one sentence beneath a photo of the empty cooler. "If prosecutors are expected to deliver justice, the least they deserve is a drink of water." The post exploded. Justice, it seemed, was thirsty. And just like that, what began as an empty water cooler had become a national question of dignity. Jasmine Crockett didn't shrug it off like a bureaucratic hiccup. She felt it in her bones. The kind of quiet, creeping insult that starts small but festers into something unforgivable. She returned to her office long after others had gone home. The halls of Capitol Hill were dark and skeletal, humming faintly with the rhythm of overnight cleaners and the distant buzz of copy machines. Government running on autopilot. But Jasmine was wide awake. Her blazer tossed over the chair, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled, eyes burning into the pale glow of her laptop screen. What she was looking for wasn't just the truth, it was the origin of the neglect. Piece by piece, her team scraped through procurement logs, OMB updates, and buried HR communications. And then it surfaced. A short, sterile memo from the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. The language was cold, surgical, almost proud of its indifference. It authorized federal departments to streamline non-essential consumables by implementing voluntary hydration programs. Employees could opt in. That meant water, basic, human, life-sustaining water, was now a billable item, and only those who paid $7 a month could access it. She read it 3 times, each word more infuriating than the last. At the bottom of the policy, centered in sharp black type, sat the signature of Shalanda Young, director of OMB. The document labeled it Budget Optimization. Jasmine saw it for what it truly was, a slow-drip betrayal. She stood in the middle of her office, memo in hand, unable to sit. Her thoughts weren't political, they were human. How had the richest government on earth reduced its own employees to subscribers for water? Then her phone rang, a private line. She considered ignoring it. It was past 1 a.m., but something told her to pick up. The voice on the other end was fragile, like it had been holding itself together for too long. "Congresswoman Crockett, I'm sorry to bother you. I work at the DC Attorney's Office. I'm a single mom. Today I drank from the bathroom faucet because I couldn't afford to skip the gas bill to pay that stupid water fee." Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't know how to interrupt a confession so raw. "I'm not trying to make this political. I don't think this is what public service should feel like." That final sentence lodged itself deep in Jasmine's chest. It wasn't outrage she felt. It was a clarity sharper than anger. She turned slowly toward her desk, laid the memo down like evidence, and looked out the window. The Capitol dome gleamed in the distance, a symbol meant to reflect justice, equality, service. But tonight, it looked hollow. And when the call ended, Jasmine Crockett didn't cry, didn't rage. She simply stood still in the dark, as if the weight of one woman's truth had changed the gravity of the entire room. By 7:15 the next morning, Jasmine was already striding through the echoing rotunda of the Capitol, flanked by two aides struggling to keep up. She wasn't dressed for television, she was dressed for war. In one hand, she carried an empty plastic water bottle, stained slightly from use. In the other, a $7 payroll deduction stub clipped to a leaked internal memo bearing the OMB seal. Tucked under her arm was a folder thick with employee testimonies, time-stamped emails, and the now infamous Budget Optimization Directive signed by Shalanda Young. The marble beneath her heels sounded sharper than usual, each step a statement. She didn't stop for questions. She didn't need a press release. She was about to make her move where it mattered most, in the chambers of power, not in the court of public opinion. At precisely 9:03 a.m., Jasmine entered the Oversight Committee chamber and made her presence impossible to ignore. The room buzzed with pre-hearing chatter until she placed the bottle, empty, clear, and damning, on the table in front of her microphone. Beside it, she unfolded the deduction slip and laid it flat like a scar. She spoke with no hesitation. "Mr. Chairman, I am formally requesting a public hearing to examine an internal OMB policy that forces federal employees to pay for access to drinking water." Gas didn't echo, but you could hear chairs stiffen. "We must summon OMB Director Shalanda Young to explain the justification behind what is being quietly called the Water Club." The subject of the hearing is simple. One question: is access to drinking water a basic right for federal employees, or a paid privilege? Silence, then murmurs, then the unmistakable sound of power being cornered. Jasmine didn't blink. She knew exactly what she was doing. When a government starts charging its own for water, it's not just a policy issue, it's a crisis of moral architecture. And today she had come to shake the foundation. The room had been sworn in, but what Jasmine was about to deliver wasn't procedure. It was a reckoning, and everyone in that chamber could feel it coming. The atmosphere inside the Oversight Committee room had shifted. The ceremonial pomp was still there. The seal of the United States glinting on the wall behind the chairman, rows of flags upright and watching, nameplates lined in bureaucratic brass. But the air itself felt heavier. This wasn't another routine hearing padded with empty gestures. This was different. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless for a moment, elbows resting firmly on the polished table, eyes locked across the aisle at Shalanda Young. The water bottle still stood where she had placed it earlier, empty, transparent, accusatory. Next to it, the $7 payroll deduction sat like a receipt for something more costly than money: dignity. Jasmine didn't adjust her mic. She didn't shuffle papers or clear her throat. She leaned in slightly, her voice low but carrying with absolute clarity. "Mrs. Young, if you had to pay out of pocket just to drink water while managing the nation's budget, would you consider that fair compensation or a betrayal?" The question didn't land like a jab. It hit like a brick. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. And truth, when laid bare in a room built on layers of political varnish, has a way of silencing everything else. Shalanda Young didn't blink, but there was a subtle shift in her shoulders, a quick, instinctive straightening of her back. Small but telling. Jasmine noticed. So did the cameras. So did the press gallery. So did the federal employees watching from break rooms and basements across the country, some of whom had drunk from faucets just to finish a shift. Jasmine held the pause, then spoke again, her tone sharpening but never rising. Because that's what happened in this very city. To your colleagues, to the people upholding the laws you work to fund. And let me be clear, this is not about dollars. This is about a government that forgets its servants are human beings. She let the final words hang in the room, not for drama, but because they needed space. They weren't a soundbite, they were a mirror. And in it, the cost of policy decisions had suddenly become unmistakable. Not just budgets or spreadsheets, but broken trust, dry mouths, and silent humiliation. Jasmine hadn't come for headlines. She'd come for accountability, and the clock had just started ticking. But when silence demands an answer, even the most measured voice can echo like a gavel falling in a cathedral. Shalanda Young sat perfectly composed behind the long oak witness table, the gold pin on her blazer catching a glint of overhead light. She didn't flinch under Jasmine's question. She didn't consult notes or lean away from the mic. Instead, she looked directly at the committee, her eyes firm and dry, and delivered her response with the poise of someone who had spent years mastering the art of rationalizing discomfort into data. We did not mandate this. It's an opt-in model designed to encourage decentralized management of office resources. There is water, but it isn't free. The words rolled out effortlessly, almost gently, but their impact landed hard, like velvet wrapping a brick. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The damage had already begun. Members of Congress sat stone still, some blinking slowly, others pressing pens to paper with a sudden urgency. The air grew dense with the weight of implications no one dared voice aloud. If water must be purchased, what else might dignity cost? The line between efficiency and cruelty had just blurred, and it had been drawn by a woman with a steady voice and a spotless resume. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The bottle on her desk, its emptiness now almost symbolic, did the speaking for her. Around the room, aides paused mid-typing. A junior staffer in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, eyes widening at the cold logic laid bare. Outside, the city buzzed as usual, unaware that inside this room, a government official had calmly declared a new norm. You can serve your country, but you will pay for your thirst. And the silence that followed was not passive. It was pregnant with disbelief, simmering just beneath the skin of order. As the silence settled like dust in the room, Shalanda reached, not for empathy, but for numbers. There was a practiced rhythm in the way she moved, deliberate but smooth, the kind of calm that only comes from years of explaining the unpalatable with a polished voice. She picked up the slim black remote from the witness table with one hand, her index finger already resting on the forward button. The projection screen behind her flickered to life with a mechanical hum, throwing a sterile, bluish light across the room. For a second, the words were still loading, just pixels forming order. Then it came into focus. OMB Cost Savings Initiative. Hydration Decentralization. And beneath that title, clean and unbothered by the emotion in the room, was a bold number. $8,200,000. Shalanda raised her hand and activated the red laser pointer. It circled the number briefly, like a seal of victory. OMB has saved $8 million annually by empowering offices to self-manage hydration services. Her voice was calm, remarkably so, given the rising tension that had taken over every corner of the committee chamber. There was no visible remorse, no hesitation, not even an attempt at rhetorical softening. The delivery was bureaucratic perfection. Her intonation didn't waver. Her cadence was unthreatening, controlled. To her, this was a win, a procedural triumph that deserved recognition. But the words hit differently on the receiving end. That number, $8 million, hung in the air like smoke from a match that had just lit a fuse. The screen behind her now showed graphs, bar charts breaking down annual water expenditures, line graphs comparing previous year's departmental supply budgets. All clinical, all defensible, and all wildly disconnected from the reality Jasmine had brought to the room. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to, not yet. She simply stared at the chart, her expression stone still, but her chest rising just slightly faster. Around the room, aides paused mid-typing. Journalists in the gallery leaned forward. A woman in a gray suit, likely from GAO, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, blinking in disbelief. "What we've implemented is not just cost-effective," Shalanda continued, turning slightly to the room. "It's scalable. Offices now have the flexibility to manage their resources according to local needs." The language was corporate, dangerously so. Each phrase stripped of humanity, each sentence crafted to sound reasonable, unassailable even. But to anyone listening closely, to anyone paying attention to what had just unfolded in the previous minutes of the hearing, it was clear. The defense of this policy wasn't grounded in empathy or logic. It was grounded in insulation, from consequence, from discomfort, from accountability. "This isn't about denying anyone access," she added, her tone softening just a touch, though still tightly controlled. "It's about removing the burden of federal micromanagement from everyday logistics. We're trusting our departments to manage themselves." Trust. Jasmine almost flinched at that word. Trust had been broken the moment a legal assistant had called her in tears, describing how she had drunk from a bathroom faucet because she couldn't afford to both drive to work and pay for office water. Trust had been forfeited when a basic necessity was turned into a line item for internal optimization. Jasmine's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. The projection changed again, this time a side-by-side slide. One chart showing national water consumption estimates for federal buildings under the old model and one under the new. The second bar was smaller, highlighted green. "You can see here," Shalanda said, motioning to the screen, "a significant drop in administrative water-related expenses, a direct result of local control and reduced federal overreach." And there it was again, the language of victory, built on the scaffolding of suffering. The entire presentation had been designed to insulate her and her office from scrutiny. To anyone watching from outside the frame of lived experience, it might have looked reasonable, even admirable. But to those who knew the truth, the women working overtime in windowless offices, the clerks who skipped lunch to afford gas, the custodians who weren't even eligible for the water plan, this wasn't policy. This was erasure. The room wasn't reacting, not audibly, but something was shifting. A quiet discomfort had crept in. You could see it in the stillness of the aides, in the darting eyes of subcommittee members now wondering how this would play on the evening news. You could hear it in the subtle tapping of a pen from a representative at the far end. No longer just taking notes, but holding on to rhythm as tension built. Shalanda clicked the remote again and turned back to face the committee fully, her voice just slightly firmer, as if now anticipating challenge. "Every dollar we save is a dollar we can reallocate to high-priority areas: housing for veterans, public school nutrition programs, digital modernization. These are real, tangible benefits that stem from responsible budgeting." For a second, the weight of that rationale tried to fill the room, but it couldn't, because at its core, it still relied on a singular, unspoken premise: that basic dignity could be deferred, or itemized, or traded for something politically safer. And Jasmine Crockett had just watched that premise be declared, boldly, proudly, in front of the nation. She wasn't surprised, but she was preparing to strike, because now the numbers had spoken, and next she would speak for the people those numbers tried to erase. And when the numbers stopped breathing, Jasmine made them bleed. She didn't reach for permission. She didn't wait for silence. Jasmine Crockett moved with the controlled tension of someone who had waited just long enough, and not 1 second more. With one hand, she lifted a sheet of paper from the manila folder in front of her, clean, creased, and marked in the upper right corner, with the most damning figure of the day: -$7. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, holding it up not just for Shalanda Young, but for the entire chamber, the press gallery and the American public watching through their screens. This wasn't theater. This was evidence. She raised the document, angled it toward the panel, and spoke, not with volume, but with sharp surgical precision. $7 times 16,000 employees equals $1.3 million taken from the pockets of federal workers. The words rang out like the snap of a courtroom exhibit hitting the floor. Cold, exact math. impossible to debate, impossible to ignore. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She let the number hang there, heavy, unblinking, while the room reacted in restrained discomfort. Eyes darted across the dais. A senior member leaned forward, suddenly very interested. An aide behind the witness table stopped typing mid-sentence. Then Jasmine set the paper down slowly on the desk, her fingertips tapping once, twice on the deduction line, like a heartbeat counting down to something far worse. Meanwhile, we're sending $2 million to a puppet program in Iraq? There was no mistaking the fury beneath her tone. She didn't mask it. She let it burn, steady and visible, like a pilot flame in full control. The phrase puppet program in Iraq wasn't just rhetorical. It was real, lifted from a grant report buried deep in the annual USAID ledger. She had read it. She had circled it in red. It had kept her up the night she got the phone call from the single mother choking back tears over bathroom faucet water. And now, it was center stage. The contrast wasn't theoretical anymore. It was visceral. $1.3 million pulled from everyday government workers, clerks, paralegals, office security, under the guise of self-managed hydration. And yet, halfway across the world, $2 million had been earmarked for culturally sensitive puppet theater to promote civic awareness. The silence that followed wasn't the usual polite pause between remarks. It was suffocating. In that moment, the ornate hearing room, with its polished mahogany and patriotic drapes, felt less like a seat of justice and more like the stage of a lie too well rehearsed. Jasmine leaned forward now, slowly, both hands pressed to the table, her voice lowering, but each word hit like a bell tolling. Mrs. Young, have you ever calculated the cost of lost trust from the people who carry this government on their backs? It wasn't a flourish. It wasn't for the cameras. It was a blow, a precise moral strike at the very foundation Shalanda had tried to defend with charts and acronyms. The question didn't require an immediate answer. It wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. And in it, every decision that had reduced a basic human need into a premium perk was suddenly exposed, raw and undeniable. Across the room, the weight of the moment shifted visibly. A junior congresswoman on the left side of the dais covered her mouth slightly with her hand. One of the House oversight staffers turned and whispered something to a colleague, eyes wide. Even the stenographer paused briefly, glancing up over her glasses, unsure whether to capture the silence or the unspoken fallout inside it. Jasmine remained motionless, her gaze fixed and unrelenting. She had offered no escape route, no softened edge. She had simply done what no chart, no budget slide, no polished testimony could do. She made them feel it, made them see that this wasn't about water or money. It was about betrayal dressed in fiscal language. It was about a government that claimed to serve its workers, but quietly penalized them for existing. And that question, still hanging in the air, wasn't just rhetorical. It was structural. It was systemic. It was the heart of the entire hearing. Have you ever calculated the cost of lost trust? That was the reckoning. Not what was spent, but what was lost. Not the dollars saved, but the souls dismissed. And Jasmine Crockett, in that moment, had done what the $8 million slide could not. She made it impossible to look away. But numbers alone couldn't capture what the system had taken. So Jasmine let a witness do what spreadsheets could not. The committee doors opened quietly. There was no announcement, no fanfare, just the soft sound of careful footsteps echoing across the marble floor. The woman who approached the witness chair looked like someone who had spent her life being told not to take up space. Her blazer was navy, but faded to a weary gray at the seams. Her shoes were sensible, polished, but cracked along the edges. She walked with her head slightly lowered, as if decades of invisible weight had trained her posture into permanent humility. Her name tag identified her as Margaret Lane, Administrative Clerk, Office of the U.S. Attorney, District of Columbia. She didn't carry a briefcase or a prepared statement, just a single sheet of folded paper in her hand, worn at the corners, clutched so tightly it was nearly torn. When she reached the seat, she hesitated, not out of fear, but the kind of restraint learned by people who are only ever allowed to speak when called upon. She sat slowly, adjusted the microphone with trembling fingers. then looked around the room, not with defiance but with an honesty so raw it made several in the audience look away. She glanced at Jasmine, who gave her the smallest of nods. That was all she needed. She turned back toward the panel, cleared her throat softly, and began. "I've served this government for 12 years. The words came out steady, but behind them was something older than exhaustion. A kind of quiet grief that only long service without recognition can create. When international guests visit our office, I pour sparkling water into glasses I'm told to polish twice. We place them on silver trays and smile like we're proud of what we serve." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. You could feel the room change with every word. No charts, no laser pointers, no sanitized phrasing, just the truth, raw and unfiltered. She paused, looking down for just a breath, her fingers gripping the folded sheet harder, as if anchoring herself to something real. "But today, I was thirsty, and I couldn't drink, because I forgot to pay the $7. Silence erupted like thunder. It was total, and it was unbearable. A chair creaked sharply as someone shifted. Another aide stopped typing. Someone in the press row dropped a pen, but didn't reach to retrieve it. All eyes remained on her, as if everyone in the room understood the horror of what had just been spoken, but couldn't yet process how we'd arrived at this moment. There was no dramatics in her tone, no righteous anger, no breaking voice. That made it worse. Her delivery wasn't emotional because the wound was no longer fresh. It had scarred over, then been reopened by indifference. She had stood behind conference room doors serving mineral water to ambassadors with foreign security details, only to return to her desk, thirsty, unnoticed, and unworthy of the same basic respect. Not because she had failed, but because she had forgotten to pay. In that single moment, the gap between optics and reality collapsed. She was no longer a statistic. She was a reflection of everything the policy had devalued: loyalty, labor, humanity. No one dared interrupt her. Even the chair of the committee leaned forward, elbows on the desk, hands folded, stripped of posture and pretense. Every congressional aide, every journalist, every staffer watching from inside or behind a screen knew this wasn't about hydration anymore. This was about being invisible until your absence hurt someone else's comfort. Jasmine Crockett watched her carefully. No notes, no whispers to aides, just stillness and locked eye contact, like she wanted to bear the weight of Margaret's words without letting the room escape them too soon. That silence, heavy, stinging, righteous, did what no policy brief or budget line item ever could. It made everyone in the chamber feel thirst, not in the throat, but in the gut. And it lingered, long after Margaret Lane stepped away, long after her hands stopped shaking, long after her voice returned to silence. The witnesses' words hadn't just landed, they had settled like dust on conscience, and Jasmine knew silence was a weapon she had just reclaimed. She rose slowly, the leather-backed chair pushing away with a groan that echoed louder than it should have. No one looked away. No one whispered. It was as if the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Jasmine Crockett stood not as a lawmaker, but as a mirror, one held up to a chamber that had just witnessed something too raw to bury under procedure. Her eyes scanned the committee panel deliberately, pausing on each face as if weighing whether they truly deserved the water in their glasses. She didn't reach for a script, didn't glance at notes. Her hands remained still by her sides, but her voice, when it came, was precise, controlled, and cold enough to make the truth impossible to dodge. You all sit here drinking water for free, while the people who uphold the law are parched downstairs. The words didn't rise in volume. They deepened in meaning. Her tone was level, almost quiet, but it cracked through the air like thunder in a sealed vault. You could hear the sting of it in the shift of fabric as someone sat back too quickly. You could feel it in the sudden pause of a stenographer's fingers above her keys. A congressional aide near the back reached slowly for the half-full bottle on the floor beside his chair, then stopped midway, suddenly aware of how it might look. One of the senators folded their hands tighter, lips drawn thin, unsure whether to react or stay frozen, because the accusation wasn't theoretical. It wasn't abstract. It was personal, and it was aimed at everyone. And Jasmine wasn't finished. She didn't follow it with stats. She didn't need to. That single line was more than a statement. It was a rupture in the polite script of the hearing. It pulled the injustice into the fluorescent light of a room where bottled water was delivered in cases, while clerks 2 floors below had to ration dignity like it was a luxury. The imbalance wasn't just policy, it was visible, immediate, and criminal in its calmness. Jasmine's eyes lingered just a moment longer. Then she sat down, not in retreat, but in control. She had dropped a truth that would outlast the news cycle. One line, one truth. And now the burden of silence was no longer hers. It belonged to the ones with full glasses and empty accountability. The silence that followed Jasmine's line about parched employees and privileged politicians could have ended the hearing then and there. But Shalanda Young wasn't finished. With her jaw clenched just tight enough to mask the strain beneath her composure, Shalanda leaned forward again, adjusted her mic with 2 fingers, and locked her eyes back onto the room. Not with defiance, but with a kind of exhausted determination. She didn't blink, didn't shift. Her voice came low, steady, and perfectly modulated, like someone reading a verdict she didn't write, but had long accepted as necessary. We cannot prioritize water if it means cutting from children's education or the Head Start program. Every priority comes with a trade-off. There was no tremor, no hesitation, and that was exactly the problem. The sentence rang out not like a defense, but a declaration of an old familiar logic, that the government was always choosing who gets less, and someone always had to lose. This time, it just happened to be the people upholding the justice system. Again. The screen behind her still flickered with the residual glow of bar graphs, but nobody was looking at numbers anymore. All eyes were on her, and more than a few mouths had hardened into flat lines. One of the committee members, who had remained relatively quiet until now, shifted in his seat and scribbled something on a notepad that looked more like a reaction than a question. A reporter in the second row tapped at her phone, not for notes, but for the quote. The room wasn't convinced, but Shalanda had said it anyway. She exhaled softly, as if expecting sympathy from a room she just framed into a false binary. And Jasmine Crockett was already on her feet before the breath left Shalanda's lungs. She didn't rise abruptly. She didn't need theatrics. Her power didn't come from volume. It came from clarity. The kind that didn't waver when confronted with institutional deflection wrapped in budget speak. She looked directly at Shalanda, not to attack, but to cut clean through the argument with surgical moral precision. The government should never force people to choose between drinking water at work and education for children. Her voice was strong, deliberate, and unmistakably anchored in something deeper than policy. She wasn't speaking as a lawmaker anymore. She was speaking as a citizen who understood betrayal, not theoretically, but personally. If those are the only options on the table, then whoever wrote that budget made the wrong choice from the beginning. The sentence was a scalpel, sharp, precise, and irreversible. You could feel the room recoil, not out of disagreement, but out of recognition, because the math didn't justify the morality. And now the illusion of trade-offs had been broken. Jasmine didn't stop speaking, but she didn't raise her voice either. She let the words carve themselves into the space between podiums and privilege. Her eyes swept slowly across the committee again, as if daring any of them to raise a hand and claim the moral ground of denying hydration to public servants in exchange for line items that belong to different debates entirely. You don't balance a nation's soul by playing God with water and children. You don't pit dignity against opportunity and call it leadership. A flicker of discomfort ran down the bench of silent representatives, like a wave pressing against a wall that had held for far too long. Jasmine continued, her tone shifting slightly, not softer, but more resolute. Each word now carried the gravity of those who had called her office, who had stood at vending machines and realized their paycheck didn't cover basic respect. There is no excuse, not austerity, not efficiency, not temporary delay, that makes it acceptable to reduce human needs into optional expenses. Shalanda sat still, but the impact was visible now, in the shifting of her pen between fingers, the narrowing of her gaze, the tightening in her jaw. She had no immediate reply because Jasmine hadn't just challenged the decision. She had cracked open its logic. Jasmine stepped slightly forward, never taking her eyes off the dais. "You're not optimizing," she said, her voice calm but colder now. "You're gambling, with dignity as the collateral." No one spoke. Not the committee, not the staffers, not even the reporters who knew better than to interrupt the kind of moment that writes itself into political history. Jasmine took one last look at the water bottle beside her, still empty, then returned her eyes to Shalanda. "You've saved $8 million, but at what cost?" That question didn't come with a slide deck or a budget appendix. It didn't need a bullet point. It was a closing argument to a moral trial that had just exposed its own flaw. Because in that room, the cost wasn't abstract. It wasn't projected or estimated. It had a voice, and it had already testified. And no one, not even the OMB director, could spreadsheet their way around it anymore. So Jasmine sat, and the silence that followed wasn't just stillness. It was something else. It was judgment, and it didn't come from the committee. It came from every American watching who had ever been told that their worth depended on what someone else called a priority. The hearing may have paused inside those marble walls, but outside the country had already exploded. What had begun as a quiet congressional hearing on government procurement policy was now an uncontainable firestorm. Before the final witness had even left the chamber, screenshots of Jasmine Crockett holding up the $7 deduction slip were circulating on X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Reddit, and Discord servers across every government department in the country. Within 20 minutes, 3 hashtags had collided into one digital superstorm: number $7 truth, number water club scandal, and number hydration gate. They weren't just trending, they were detonating across devices from Sacramento to Savannah. In a Washington, D.C. mailroom, a janitor on break held up his phone with trembling hands, watching the live stream on mute, his face frozen as he read the live captions of Margaret Lane's testimony. In Albuquerque, a librarian paused mid-shelving to open her feed, where a federal clerk from Boise had posted a photo of the water station in her hallway, chained shut, with a laminated sign, "For members only, $7 a month deducted automatically." Under it, the caption read, "This is how they thank us for 15 years of service." It was no longer a policy issue, it was a reckoning. Civil servants from every branch of government began posting their own truths. Images of empty water dispensers, torn payroll stubs, emails confirming opt-in hydration memberships, and videos filmed from staff-only restrooms, where faucets dripped beside paper signs that said, "Bring your own bottle." An anonymous TSA agent uploaded footage from a staff break room at Reagan National. 3 vending machines, 2 broken faucets, 1 cooler marked out of service. The post went viral with the caption, "We screen 5,000 passengers a day. We can't even get water that works." By hour 2, a grassroots campaign had begun without anyone needing to organize it. Dozens of government employees printed signs reading, "Thirsty for Justice," and taped them outside elevators, courtroom hallways, and federal office bulletin boards. A court clerk in Tampa created a TikTok in front of a locked utility closet where the water delivery was supposed to go. She turned to camera, visibly exhausted. "It's not about the $7, it's about the message. You don't matter enough to hydrate." The video reached 1.8 million views by the end of the day. Across union halls and federal agency message boards, screenshots of Shalanda Young's statement, "We cannot prioritize water if it means cutting from children's education or the Head Start program," became a national punchline, then a national outrage. Reddit threads tore apart the math. Twitter users started posting comparative infographics, the annual federal budget next to a water cooler invoice. On Instagram, a trending graphic overlaid with bold white text read, $6.6 trillion budget, $0 water, let that sink in. Meanwhile, national news outlets scrambled to catch up with the pace of the narrative. CNN's Anderson Cooper cut his foreign affairs segment short, switching to live footage of government workers walking out of the Department of Justice during their lunch break, holding up signs that said, "We serve justice. Justice serves us nothing." MSNBC devoted an entire hour of coverage under the segment banner, "Dignity with Interest, when Basic Needs Become Budget Lines." Fox News, uncharacteristically aligned, hosted a panel titled, When the system forgets its own, what the $7 scandal reveals about Washington's priorities. It was everywhere. The New York Times ran a rare second evening edition with the headline stretched in stark, uncompromising font. $1 trillion government and one employee without a bottle. Beneath the headline was the now iconic photo. Margaret Lane, her head slightly bowed, hands folded tight in front of a federal microphone. The hollow space between her and the bottle of water that never arrived. By nightfall, that image had replaced campaign logos and celebrity photos as the most shared post on social media. Even verified accounts from Hollywood and professional sports reposted the image with captions like, "This isn't just a federal problem, it's an American problem." NFL players wore number $7 truth stickers on their gear during post-practice interviews. A Grammy-winning artist stopped mid-concert to hold up a water bottle, unscrew the cap slowly and say, "This is what they're charging our public servants for." Then she poured it out on stage. The cultural tide didn't just turn, it roared. And when the nation refused to look away, Congress realized it could no longer hide. They tried at first with silence, with briefings behind closed doors, with redirected press inquiries and half-hearted memos calling the situation under administrative review. But the headlines didn't die. The hashtags didn't fade. The hearing footage was replayed on every major network for 3 consecutive nights. Editorials from both ends of the political spectrum called it a national embarrassment. International media dubbed it the $7 scandal. One Canadian anchor asked on air, "How does the richest democracy in the world charge its public servants to stay hydrated?" The pressure didn't just mount, it exploded. Staff inboxes filled with over 500,000 public messages in 72 hours. Congressional phone lines jammed. Several lawmakers were confronted by federal workers in their own districts, at train stations, pharmacies, and public events, who asked, sometimes trembling, "Will you vote for my right to water?" And so, in a rare act of political urgency, Congress moved. They renamed the proposal with intentional clarity. The Water is a Right Act. The bill itself was only 14 pages long, but every sentence was weighed like scripture. It stated plainly that all federal workplaces, without exception, must provide clean, free, and unlimited access to drinking water. No opt-in fees, no tiered systems, no qualifications. It included language about accountability and enforcement, a penalty clause, mandatory transparency reports. But it wasn't the legal structure that made history. It was what the bill represented, a reversal of values that had, for too long, treated labor as disposable and dignity as negotiable. By the time it reached the House floor, the public gallery was full. Court clerks, janitors, assistant prosecutors, VA nurses, customs agents, archivists. Some wore pins shaped like tiny water bottles. Others held their original $7 payroll stubs, laminated and raised like protest signs in the quiet. C-SPAN broadcast the session live. Major networks interrupted programming. For once, all of Washington watched itself and knew it was being watched. When the vote began, the atmosphere wasn't celebratory. It was tense. Nobody trusted the moment until it was done. Eyes flicked to screens overhead as votes were cast one by one. Names appeared green or red beside party affiliations. In the back row, a clerk from New Jersey clutched a printout of her daughter's school lunch menu. She had once skipped lunch to afford gas and the monthly hydration fee. Now she stared at the screen, whispering each yay under her breath. The final tally arrived in sharp digital letters, 354 yeas. Arubattuwunderneiger. It wasn't unanimous, but it was overwhelming. The clerk of the House stood, cleared her throat, and read the result in language so procedural it barely contained the human weight behind it. The motion passes. The Water is a Right Act is hereby adopted. And for a few seconds, no one moved. Then the sound began. Not thunderous applause, but something slower, steadier. A kind of reverent clapping, like a collective exhale shaped by months, even years of silent humiliation. A postal worker wiped his eyes with one hand and clapped with the other. A Capitol police officer standing at the exit broke protocol and whispered, "Thank you." Members of Congress rose from their seats, not all but most, and looked up at the gallery. For the first time in a long time, it was not them who had spoken, but those they were supposed to serve. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly through it all, her hands folded atop the desk, the old empty bottle still sitting beside her. She didn't smile. She didn't blink away tears. She just breathed, deeply, slowly, like someone who had held her breath for too many days. She didn't need a speech. The bottle had already spoken louder than she ever could. And today, finally, Congress had answered back. Not with platitudes, not with delayed memos, but with law. But a law on paper means nothing unless the system is forced to obey. And this time, obedience came fast, loud, and humbling. Within hours of the water is a right act being signed into law. The Office of Management and Budget, which had once brushed off internal complaints as non-essential noise, was engulfed in a quiet but furious storm of accountability. Inside their DC headquarters, the once cocky architects of the hydration opt-in model stared at internal memos with faces drained of color. What had been passed off as cost savings innovation was now under federal review, public investigation, and relentless digital scrutiny. The truth had already spilled beyond control. The OIG audit showed not just scattered errors, but a systemic deduction program affecting over 300,000 employees across agencies and states. Some charged for water at field offices where even plumbing was unreliable. The headlines didn't exaggerate. They didn't have to. They printed the numbers straight from OMB's own records. $22.4 million deducted over 2 years, zero oversight. Suddenly, silence was no longer strategy. It was an admission. Senior officials huddled behind glass doors. Phones buzzed. Legal counsel was summoned. And then, like a dam cracking under the weight of its own pressure, the collapse came. A new directive, rushed through 3 layers of approval, was issued at 2:11 a.m. Friday morning. It was concise, clinical, and nothing short of historic. The memo announced that effective immediately, all opt-in water programs were terminated and a full 12-month reimbursement would be issued to every employee affected. No application needed. The statement was cold, but one line stood out in stark, unadorned shame. We acknowledge this decision was wrong. Those 6 words hit federal inboxes like thunder. Across the country, employees forwarded the email to each other with one-line reactions. Is this real? We made them blink. Finally. In Denver, a room full of IRS analysts stood in a stunned silence after receiving it. In New Orleans, a group of VA staffers clapped quietly in a break room before going back to work. The reversal didn't erase what happened, but it proved something far more potent. When the country paid attention, the system had no choice but to listen. And then came the press conference. The morning sun over Capitol Hill was crisp, the air unusually still. Barricades had gone up overnight. Reporters gathered by the dozens. CNN, PBS, Reuters, even BBC and Al Jazeera. A temporary stage had been erected in front of the Rayburn building, framed by a white vinyl backdrop with 3 bold words: dignity, not deductions. Security was tight, but the crowd wasn't unruly. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there because history doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes with policy and pain, with someone finally saying what everyone else had whispered for too long. At 9 a.m. sharp, Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the platform alone. No entourage, no hype team. She wore a deep cobalt suit, clean, structured, unembellished, her hair tied back, her eyes locked forward. She approached the microphone without a single note in her hands. Reporters braced themselves, but there were no theatrics, only stillness. And then she spoke. They call us the party of spending. Well, I'll spend everything I have on the only thing worth it, human dignity. The sentence hit with the weight of a gavel. Cameras clicked, heads turned. A journalist from Politico lowered his tablet mid-typing. Someone in the 3rd row exhaled audibly. Jasmine didn't pause for applause. She let the silence hold her words like glass, fragile, sharp, and impossible to ignore. For months, they told us it was just $7, just a membership, just a line item. But today, this government admits what we already knew. It was never just about water. It was about what people deserve just to be human while they serve this country. Behind her, Aides from multiple federal agencies stood shoulder to shoulder, many still in uniform. A parks officer, a postal clerk, a paralegal from Baltimore in an old jacket with a union pin. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. You cannot run a democracy on empty glasses and broken backs, Jasmine said, her voice rising now, not in volume, but in clarity. And if we have to scream just to be given what we bleed to protect, then yes, call us loud, call us aggressive, but don't ever call us ungrateful again. Because the ones who had nothing asked for the least, and they were still denied. She paused, her hands folded gently on the podium. Her next words came softer, but they cut deeper. This was never about policy. It was about power deciding who is worth hydrating. And now, that power has been checked. The crowd didn't clap. They held their breath. Jasmine's voice steadied. To every worker who rationed bottles, to every mother who called my office, to the ones who drank from faucets and still showed up at 6 a.m., this win is yours. Your dignity was never up for debate. But today, the country finally said so in writing. She stepped back from the podium. Her speech was over, but no one left right away. The press didn't rush to file. The camera operators didn't signal cut. The silence in that moment, full, emotional, complete, was louder than any protest, more powerful than any chant. It was the kind of silence that only follows justice hard-won. And for once, the country stood still, just long enough to let it matter. And when the cameras shut off and the microphones went quiet, what remained was not applause, it was reckoning. The Water Club scandal, at its surface, seemed absurd. $7 for water. But beneath the surface, beneath the headlines and hashtags, lay a chilling truth. This was never about water. It was about the line where inconvenience becomes indifference, and where indifference becomes institutional. It was about the quiet calculus that happens in windowless rooms, where dignity is measured not by need, but by cost. For years, the system had made its workers choose between compliance and silence. They paid the $7, not because they agreed, but because it was easier than asking why they had to. And that's what made it dangerous. Not the fee, but the resignation it created. A nation that claims to be the greatest democracy on earth had reduced its own servants to subscribers of hydration. When Jasmine Crockett stood up, she wasn't just holding a bottle. She was holding up a mirror, and the reflection stunned the country. This scandal forced a question too many in power had stopped asking. What is the government for? Is it a structure of law, or is it a reflection of people? Because a government that tracks missile funding to the cent but forgets to provide clean water to the hands that file its casework is not a system failing at the margins. It is a system failing at its core. What Jasmine exposed wasn't one bad policy. It was a culture of budget over breadth, of compliance over compassion. In a world of $2 trillion defense bills and million-dollar coffee contractors, the idea that a paralegal had to pay for water became a symbol of how far we'd strayed. The backlash wasn't just viral because it was shocking. It was viral because it was relatable. Every nurse who buys their own gloves, every teacher who stocks their own classroom, every federal worker who skips lunch to afford a MetroCard, they all saw themselves in that $7 charge. And suddenly, Jasmine's hearing wasn't just a political event, it became a national confession booth. When the refund checks began arriving, they came in plain envelopes. No apology, no ceremony, just silence trying to clean up after itself. For some workers, it was an extra $84. For others, it triggered flashbacks of every unpaid hour, every skip benefit, every non-essential designation. But the money wasn't the point. It was proof. Proof that someone had finally forced the machine to flinch. Jasmine Crockett had not led a protest. She had triggered a reawakening, and not with slogans, but with facts, faces, and the kind of unshakable conviction that makes a system blink. What followed wasn't just legislation, it was institutional memory being rewritten. Agencies started double-checking old deduction models. Unions began auditing expense authorizations. Middle managers who once rolled their eyes at water policy were now triple signing invoices. Something had shifted, permanently, Not just because of one hearing, but because the hearing proved that no injustice is too small when it's repeated often enough. The moral lesson of this moment isn't printed in the statute books. It isn't in the fine print of the refund memo. It lives in the thousands of unspoken stories that surfaced after Jasmine's hearing. Stories of custodians eating saltine crackers to save gas money, of interns refilling mugs from janitorial sinks because the filtered water was reserved for directors, of clerks being warned not to stir things up if they wanted promotion. Dignity wasn't lost all at once. It was eroded, drop by drop, until no one noticed it was gone. And that is the most dangerous kind of injustice, the kind that masquerades as policy, the kind that gets normalized through repetition. Jasmine ripped the veil off that illusion, and what she uncovered wasn't just unethical, it was un-American. Jasmine's statement at the press conference, "I'll spend everything I have on the only thing worth it, human dignity," was more than a soundbite. It was a line in the sand, because when a society starts charging people for the basics, air, water, time, it signals something terrifying. That value has replaced worth. That profit has replaced people. And that's where the lesson sharpens. In America, we love to talk about freedom. But what good is freedom when your body isn't free to hydrate without penalty? What good is liberty when silence is cheaper than speaking up? The Water Club scandal taught us this. Tyranny doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it arrives via memo. Sometimes it's deducted in silence. And sometimes it hides behind the word efficiency. What Jasmine taught us, what Margaret Lane showed us, is that dignity is not a perk. It is not an extra. It is not a line item. It is the foundation. Without it, everything collapses. Without it, the law becomes theater. Without it, democracy becomes branding. And the most painful truth? We didn't lose it all at once. We handed it away in pieces. Through inaction, through fear, through believing that someone else would fight harder. Jasmine didn't fight harder. She fought louder and she fought smarter, and she refused to let the absurdity of the policy distract from the humanity it erased. In that refusal, she gave us something more enduring than a policy win. She gave us a roadmap back to conscience. The lesson, then, is not just about water. It's about resistance in the face of bureaucracy, about the courage to call indignity by its name even when the price of speaking up is loneliness, mockery, or silence. It's about remembering that the strongest people in a democracy are rarely the loudest. They're the ones who carry its weight when no one is watching. They are the unseen, the overworked, the quiet backbones of government buildings, courtrooms, field offices, mailrooms. This story belongs to them. And so does its legacy. Because in the end, the true cost of the Water Club wasn't the $7. It was the trust we lost when we let it happen, and the triumph we reclaimed when we finally said no more. But a lesson unacted upon is just memory, and Jasmine Crockett didn't fight for memory. She fought for movement. Now it's our turn, not just to remember but to respond. You don't need a podium to speak. You don't need a title to stand. Every office, every department, every hallway where injustice was tolerated, those are now battlegrounds for dignity. Speak up when someone is shamed for asking questions. Demand audits when systems hide behind spreadsheets. Share the story when someone says, "It's not a big deal," because it is. What you normalize today becomes your cage tomorrow. The Water Club wasn't an exception. It was a warning. And the only reason it ended is because people who were told to stay quiet refused to. So don't wait for the next hearing to go viral. Make your workplace impossible to ignore now. Ask your supervisor where your department's hydration policy is. Find the hidden fees. Push for your union to review wellness standards. Create space for the newest staffer to speak without fear. Elevate every small injustice like it's the tip of something bigger, because it usually is. Call your representative, not just when it's about politics, but when it's about people. Remind them that the law is only as honorable as the ones enforcing it. And when they say there's no room in the budget for dignity, ask them why they always seem to find room for silence. Jasmine Crockett proved that even the most invisible worker can bring Washington to its knees with one voice. So imagine what millions of us could do if we all stood up at once. This is your moment, not next election season, not after one more scandal. Now, if you are a public servant, ask your HR department for the transparency report on employee deductions. If you're a citizen, ask your city council where its lowest paid workers get their water, their breaks, their protections. If you're a manager, stop asking how much things cost and start asking what they mean. And if you're a legislator, know this: the public is watching, and they've learned that $7 betrayals will not stay buried anymore. Use your platform to push for transparency mandates, require dignity clauses in vendor contracts, and write policy that assumes people aren't lucky to be employed. They're essential to everything. Let Jasmine's work be your blueprint, not your exception. To students, organizers, civic workers, teachers, your power isn't theoretical, it's practical. Change happens not when everyone agrees, but when one person stops apologizing for caring too much. Start dignity audits in your schools, print posters, write into newsletters, organize water justice check-ins with public employees, push agencies to publish how they treat their staff, not just how they serve the public. If you're in tech, build tools that let whistleblowers speak anonymously. If you're in media, dig deeper than headlines. Expose how normalized deprivation works in policy. And if you're just someone with a phone and a platform, use it. Every clip, every quote, every spotlight fuels the fire that keeps government honest. Let this be the day we stop waiting for heroes and become systems of accountability ourselves. Let the memory of what happened here be carved into every office that once charged for water. Let every employee who drank from a bathroom sink know they were never alone. They were the beginning of a wave. Jasmine just helped it break. And now it's your turn. Not to admire the echo, but to amplify the call. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside the Washington state capitol, with 20 million eyes locked in and a nation on edge, Governor Bob Ferguson tries to justify a jaw-dropping new law, one that blocks parents from accessing their children's medical records at school. He calls it progress. He calls it protection. But just minutes into the hearing, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett obliterates his defense with leaked documents, hospital records, and the voices of betrayed parents echoing through the chamber. The room freezes. The truth detonates. If a parent isn't allowed to know what's being done to their child, then do they have any rights left at all? The oak doors of Olympia Town Hall swung open to a storm of flash bulbs and national cameras. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a battlefield. Protesters packed the marble stairway, shouting, "Parental rights are human rights," on one side, "Protect trans youth now," on the other. The air was electric, on the edge of combustion. Governor Bob Ferguson stepped into the chamber to a split crowd, cheers clashing with boos. He wore the kind of calm, calculating smile that only politicians facing fire can manage. Security tensed. The room was a live wire. Then Jasmine Crockett entered. No entourage, no hesitation, just the sharp staccato of heels and a gaze that cut through noise. Cameras pivoted. Lawmakers turned. Some saw a disruptor, others a defender. She moved like a blade, precise, unshaken. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas," the speaker announced, "here to represent families across the nation." The room murmured, not in protest but recognition. She took her seat. The silence wasn't peace. It was pressure before the storm. Then came the hammer of authority. The chairman of the hearing, an aging senator with a gavel and a trembling voice made firm by conviction, stood and spoke. "Today," he declared, "we will determine one thing and one thing only. Where does the line lie between protecting a child and erasing their parents?" The room held its breath. Because if the state now sees fit to know everything about our children and tell us nothing, then perhaps it's not the family that's broken, but the system that wants to replace it. No one moved. Every camera was rolling, every heartbeat audible. And in that moment, With all eyes on her, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't have to. The storm was already here, and she was its center. The silence didn't last. As the tension settled over the chamber like a low fog, the chairman gave a subtle nod. All eyes turned. Governor Bob Ferguson rose from his seat with the kind of deliberate calm that wasn't meant to de-escalate. It was meant to signal control. His suit was flawless, every movement measured, every pause rehearsed. This wasn't a man explaining a policy. This was a man defending a mission. He approached the podium like a prosecutor stepping into closing arguments, shoulders square, voice low, but unshakable. "We are not here to strip parents of their rights," Ferguson began, his tone dipped in reason, but sharpened like a blade behind glass. "We are here to protect children from harm, from abuse, from neglect, from households that cannot or will not accept who they truly are." He didn't flinch as murmurs rippled through the room. He welcomed them. To him, dissent was proof of courage. His hand reached into his folder, fingers brushing over printed pages like armor. One by one, he named institutions: the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Association of School Psychologists, the American Psychological Association. Each name landed like a legal stamp, a credential stacked atop another to form a towering wall. "These organizations," he continued, "have made it clear. When it comes to mental health, gender identity, and the safety of our children, privacy and autonomy can be life-saving. They are not luxuries. They are necessities." He paused just long enough for the camera lights to flicker, just long enough to let the implication settle. That standing against this law was standing against science, against compassion, against the very idea of protection. When a child is afraid to tell their parents they're depressed, when a teenager risks homelessness for coming out as trans, that is where this law draws the line, he said, his voice rising not in volume, but in weight. Around him, the crowd was split like fault lines. On one side, quiet nods and murmurs of approval. On the other, frowns deepening into clenched jaws, arms folded in disbelief. But Ferguson pressed on. "We must empower schools, counselors, shelters to act, even when parents can't or won't." That line cut through the room like a gust of wind slamming through a crack in a door. It was the pivot point, the place where philosophy met policy, where theory touched raw nerves. To Ferguson, it was a lifeline. To others, it was a gauntlet. Then he said it, the phrase that lit the fuse, the sentence that would echo long after the hearing ended. Broadcast, clipped, and dissected across millions of screens. "This law is not a threat. It is progress. It is compassion. It is the policy of a new era." A stillness returned, but this time it didn't come from reverence. It came from combustion held in place by force of will. Lawmakers didn't look at Ferguson. They looked at Jasmine. She hadn't spoken a word. She didn't need to. Her back was straight, her breath slow. But her fingers, those hands that had written legislation, defended lives, drawn fire from every side of the aisle, they curled, slowly, into a quiet, gathering fist. There was no applause, no rebuttal, not yet, just the sound of the storm turning, quietly, patiently, toward her. But storms don't stay quiet for long. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, deliberately, like a tide that knew exactly how high it intended to reach. Her movements were calm but not casual. There was nothing accidental about the way she stood, the way she turned toward the chamber, or the way the room instinctively leaned back as she drew breath. There was no microphone adjustment, no glance at notes. She didn't need them. What she carried wasn't printed in folders or backed by think tanks. It was lived. It was real. And it was sharp enough to draw blood. You cannot call it protection if it requires erasing parents from their children's lives, she began, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. The words weren't shouted, but they hit harder than anything that had come before. Bob Ferguson didn't flinch, but the corners of his mouth tightened just slightly. The first visible crack. Jasmine let her eyes sweep across the faces in front of her. Legislators, lobbyists, parents, activists, journalists, all seated in a room that just moments ago had given Ferguson its full attention. Now every gaze belonged to her. "You want to talk about fear?" she continued, voice unwavering. "In Texas, a 13-year-old girl collapsed in the hallway of her middle school from the side effects of medication she was given at school. Medication her parents never even knew existed in her life. She was rushed to the hospital. Her mother found out from the ER doctor, not from the school. No call, no warning, no permission. She let the details linger, not to dramatize, but because they deserved to be felt. You could hear the soft gasp from someone in the back. You could see a father lower his head, jaw clenched. This wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't a projection. It had already happened. And it was happening again. In silence, in secret, behind policies written with polished phrases and progressive branding. Jasmine took a step closer, not toward the governor, but toward the truth that had been trying to claw its way into the room since the first word was spoken. "I've read your reports, Governor. I've seen your signatures. But none of them explain this. How many children have to collapse? How many parents have to find out after the fact that their rights have been signed away behind closed doors?" The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Impossible to ignore. Impossible to clean up. She didn't look away. She didn't soften. Because there was nothing soft about being the only adult who shows up when a child breaks. "Tell me," she said, drawing her final words with brutal precision, "how many children have to pay the price so this government can feel progressive?" Silence followed, but it wasn't passive. It wasn't empty. It was the sound of people being forced to reevaluate which side of the room they were sitting on and why. Jasmine didn't return to her seat right away. She stood there steady, letting the weight of her words do what legislation so rarely does: make people feel the cost of what they were calling progress. The room was holding its breath, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. She could have paused, let the silence linger a little longer. But she didn't come to Olympia to let the air settle. She came to unsettle it. With a quiet motion, she reached into the folder beside her and pulled out a single document. A printed page marked with a bold black header, "Parental Rights Watch. Incident Report, Pierce County." The paper wasn't thick, but in her hand, it felt weightier than anything that had come before. "This is from a report by Parental Rights Watch," she said, holding the page up so the press cameras, the lawmakers, and, most importantly, the governor could see it. "Tacoma, Washington, 7th grade, a child, a little girl, was taken during school hours to receive a puberty blocker injection." She said it without flinching, but the room reacted. Audible shifting in the seats, a few brows furrowed, a whisper somewhere to her left. Jasmine let the words land before she continued. Her parents were not told. Not before. Not after. They only found out when she began to suffer complications. Nausea, hormonal imbalances, blackouts. She slowed, letting each word hit. She was hospitalized. The doctor asked about the medication. The parents said they had no idea she was ever given anything. No one responded. No one dared. And that was the point. The injustice wasn't just in the facts. It was in the silence they were wrapped in. It was in the fact that such a thing could happen under the banner of protection, under the signature of a law meant to shield, not shatter, the connection between parent and child. Jasmine let her eyes move slowly across the room, from senators shifting uncomfortably in their chairs to the staffers scribbling, blinking hard. Somewhere, someone's hand covered their mouth. Maybe from disbelief, maybe guilt. She gave them all one more second to absorb the image of that child, that hospital bed, that phone call never made. Then she stepped forward, her gaze locked on Governor Ferguson, calm, piercing, unrelenting. "This isn't a story. This is data. This is documented. This is policy made flesh and failing." Her voice was steady, but something darker stirred beneath it now. Controlled outrage, sharpened into clarity. "Tell me, Governor, do you call this progress? Or is this a mistake, legalized by the stroke of your pen?" The question didn't just hang in the air. It settled into every corner of the room like smoke after an explosion. Because no policy brief, no media soundbite, no applause line could erase what had just been said. It wasn't political anymore. It was personal, and everyone in that chamber knew it. The weight of Jasmine's final question still lingered in the air like smoke after a detonation. No one had answered her. No one dared. It was the kind of question that didn't beg for a reply. It demanded a reckoning. But the hearing wasn't finished. Before anyone could fill the silence with platitudes or pivot points, the chairman leaned into his mic and cleared his throat. His voice, while composed, carried the unmistakable edge of someone bracing the room for impact. To further inform this hearing, he said carefully, we will now hear testimony from a medical professional operating under protective confidentiality. Please understand, this witness has requested anonymity due to potential professional retaliation. That sentence alone caused a ripple in the chamber. Heads turned. Journalists adjusted their cameras. Even the most attached aides leaned forward. A side door opened slowly, not the grand central entrance used by lawmakers and press, but a plain utility door near the witness stand. From it emerged a woman in plain navy blue medical scrubs. Her posture was humble but rigid. You could see it in the way she walked, measured steps, as if each one cost her something. Her face was blurred on the monitors, her voice routed through a digital filter that turned her every syllable into something otherworldly. Not robotic, but detached, ghosted. She didn't speak right away. She sat at the witness table behind a privacy screen and placed a worn manila folder down in front of her like it weighed 100 pounds. Then, with a steadiness that had clearly taken days to summon, she began. I've been working in school-based health services in Washington for nearly 8 years, she said. I love my job. I love these kids. I didn't come here to be political, but I also didn't come to keep secrets anymore. What I've seen over the past few years is not written in any official handbook. It's not in the public training modules, but it's real, and it's enforced, quietly. She raised a printed sheet of paper with no official header, just bullet points and bold phrases. This is what we call a soft directive. It's not law, but it's treated like one. It was circulated to health offices in multiple schools, sometimes by word of mouth, sometimes by internal memo. The message was clear. Do not involve parents in certain medical matters. She paused to let that sink in. Not suggest, not use judgment. It was categorical. It included guidelines around birth control, hormone blockers, mental health meds, anything that could be seen as sensitive. That word, sensitive, hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The filtered voice continued, calm but strained. And here's the part that finally pushed me to speak out. Even in emergencies, even when a student was clearly unwell, physically suffering, we were told to think twice before contacting the parents. At that, a low murmur rippled through the room. One of the senators shifted in his seat. A woman in the audience raised her hand to her mouth. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her focus locked on the screen. The witness went on. I want to share one example. Last spring, a student, 7th grade, came into the office complaining of dizziness, blurred vision, and stomach pain. After checking her chart, I learned she had received an injection through a school clinic partnership a few days earlier. A puberty blocker. She wasn't fully aware of the side effects, and she didn't know she could decline. She thought she had to take it. Another breath, this one heavier. I wanted to call her mother, instinctively, professionally, morally, but when I asked my supervisor, I was told, and I quote, "We don't want to open that door." I pushed again. I said, "What if it's serious?" And they looked me in the eye and said, "That's not your decision." So I didn't call. There was no sound now, not even the rustling of papers, just stillness, thick and undeniable. She ended up in the emergency room that night, the woman said, quieter now. The parents were terrified. They didn't know what had happened. They thought maybe it was food poisoning, maybe a virus. They took the blame onto themselves. And to this day, they still don't know she was injected at school. The weight of that final line hit harder than any policy debate could have. It wasn't abstract. It was real. And no one in the room could pretend otherwise. The witness sat still for a moment longer, then gently pushed the microphone away folded her hands and said nothing more. But Jasmine Crockett was already moving. She rose from her chair like something coiled was finally unspooling. Not rushed, not theatrical, but full of purpose. Full of fire she wasn't going to hide. She didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. She looked at the lawmakers in the room, each of them, as if daring them to look back. Some did, others looked away. Then she spoke, and her voice was low but cutting. The kind of voice that quiets a room, not because it shouts, but because it holds truth with unbearable clarity. The issue here is not whether we protect children. The issue is who we trust to do it. She paused, letting the silence turn into gravity. If a parent can be replaced by a directive, by a whisper from a supervisor, then we haven't built a safety net. We've built a wall, one that keeps the people who love children most completely in the dark. The way she said it, steady, precise, turned the abstract into the visceral. These weren't just policies on paper. They were blindfolds, and someone was choosing to tie them on. Jasmine took one more step toward the center of the floor, her voice still calm, but tinged now with something deeper. Not anger, but betrayal and conviction. We tell parents they're the first responders in their children's lives. We tell them to be involved, to be present, to be responsible. But now we're saying, not here, not when it matters, not when a decision is made behind a locked door with no key offered. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She delivered the words like a slow, controlled burn. So I ask this committee, and I ask this governor, how many more parents are going to get phone calls from emergency rooms before someone admits this isn't safety? This is abandonment, dressed in bureaucracy. The room was dead silent, not because they had no words, but because hers had already said what needed to be said. And no one, not even the ones who voted for the law, could escape what they now knew. That someone, somewhere had followed the rules and left a child's parents in the dark. That someone, somewhere had obeyed the system and helped break the bond that could have saved that child. And that Jasmine Crockett, standing alone but never more powerful, had just torn the mask off that system in front of the entire country. But just when the chamber seemed frozen in silence, paralyzed by the weight of what had just been revealed, Jasmine Crockett moved again. This time she didn't raise her voice. She didn't take the mic. She simply reached for a slim black remote resting on the desk in front of her. A quiet click. One heartbeat. Then the lights in the chamber dimmed slightly as the large screen behind the witness table flickered to life. The state seal briefly appeared, then faded, replaced by the familiar blue and white banner of Como News, one of the largest and oldest local news stations in Washington state. There were no fancy transitions, no dramatic music, just a live news clip, time-stamped just 3 weeks prior, playing in front of the entire room. Unedited, unscripted, and devastatingly real. The segment opened with footage of an ambulance parked outside Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Then it cut to a reporter standing stiffly in the drizzling rain, her umbrella tucked under one arm as she addressed the camera. A 12-year-old girl was rushed to the ER after suffering a severe allergic reaction to a contraceptive medication administered during school hours, the reporter said, her tone clipped, professional, but clearly strained. The child's family claims they were never informed their daughter was receiving medical treatment at school and only learned of it after hospital staff questioned them about the prescription. A hushed murmur swept through the room. Lawmakers leaned forward. Some exchanged glances. Others stared straight ahead, frozen. The segment continued, cutting briefly to a blurred photo, the child's medical intake sheet from the hospital. On it, the medication was clearly listed. Below that, the words, administered by school clinic, no parental notification. Then came the voiceover again, this time colder. The district has declined comment, citing student privacy laws. The screen faded to black, and then silence. The kind that didn't wait for permission. Jasmine stood in front of the screen, bathed in its glow. Her silhouette was sharp, motionless, but her presence filled the room like oxygen rushing into a sealed chamber. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She simply raised her hand and pointed directly at the screen, her voice steady and surgically precise. "This isn't Texas," she said. Her words rang like a bell struck in a cathedral. She took a slow step forward, her eyes sweeping the room, meeting the faces of every official still clinging to the idea that this law was abstract, hypothetical, safe. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't a hoax. She paused, not for drama, but because the truth didn't need embellishment. This is Washington, the very state where this law was passed, and already it has consequences. The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was trembling. It was the silence of people realizing they'd just seen the future, and it had already become the present. Jasmine let the moment stretch just long enough for the point to embed. Then, and only then, did she return to her seat. Not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with the heavy stillness of someone who had just told the truth in a room full of people who could no longer pretend they didn't hear it. And just when the weight of Jasmine's voice began to settle over the room like fog rolling in after a storm, the silence cracked. Not with rebuttal, not with procedure, but with something raw and utterly human. It started with a single noise, the unmistakable scrape of a chair leg against marble. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the breathless quiet. Heads turned, cameras swiveled. At the back of the chamber, near the far right wall, a man had risen to his feet. Mid-40s, weathered face, sun-darkened skin. His posture was tense, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched white. He looked like a man who didn't come here to speak, who maybe never intended to speak again. But whatever restraint he'd brought with him had been shattered. He stepped forward, just one stride past the velvet barrier meant to separate citizens from the official floor. And when he spoke, it was as if every word had been stored behind his ribs for months, waiting for this moment to break free. "That story," he said, voice shaking with barely held fire. "That's my daughter. That's my child. That's the truth." The entire chamber recoiled as if struck. You could hear the air shift. Aides froze mid-sentence. Senators stiffened in their chairs. Even the security staff hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or bear witness. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't need it. "I only found out she was in the hospital 2 days later. Not from the school, not from anyone who's supposed to care." His voice rose with every word, unpolished but devastating. "I found out when she could barely stand. When she told me her stomach burned for hours and she didn't know why. I called every number they gave me. You know what I got?" He pointed now, not aimlessly, but directly toward the long table of lawmakers and officials. His fingers shook, but his aim was steady. "A voicemail. A damn voicemail." Gasps erupted across the chamber, not from shock alone, but from recognition, from the terrible clarity that comes when something theoretical becomes flesh and blood. This wasn't a headline. This was a father, a daughter, a silence that had consequences. He kept going, even as two security guards began to move quietly down the aisle toward him. "You think this law protects children?" he shouted, voice breaking under its own weight. "It turned my daughter into a patient and made me a stranger." The final word, stranger, landed like a gavel that no judge had dared to swing. He didn't run, didn't resist. As the guards reached him, he didn't lash out. He just stood there, arms limp now at his sides, eyes wide with a grief too big for the room. "Do you know what it's like," he asked, lower now but no less devastating, "to sit next to your child in a hospital bed and not know what happened to her? To realize someone else made a decision, and all you got was silence?" No one replied. They couldn't. What answer could possibly justify that? The moderator, pale and visibly shaken, called for a recess. His voice cracked slightly as he ordered the hearing paused. Staffers moved quickly. The father was gently guided back behind the curtain, not dragged but ushered. Like a man whose pain had earned him, if not justice, at least a moment of dignity. The cameras didn't cut immediately. Before the networks could switch feeds or cue commercials, one camera remained trained on the witness table. Jasmine Crockett was still seated. She hadn't moved a muscle, not in protest, not in shock. Her gaze followed the man until he vanished from view, not with the detached expression of a politician witnessing disruption, but with the fierce, unswerving stillness of a woman who had seen too many versions of that father in too many states, in too many hearings, ignored too many times. Her expression wasn't pity, it was memory, resolve, fire held behind glass. And in that moment, with the cameras still live and the chamber frozen between chaos and consequence, her eyes told the whole story. This wasn't a hearing anymore. This was a wound, and someone had finally dared to show the scar. The chamber was still vibrating with the emotional aftershocks of the father's outburst. The weight of his voice, that raw public wound, still hung over the room like smoke after an explosion. But Governor Bob Ferguson wasn't done. He waited just long enough for the tremor to fade before standing again, this time with a new edge in his posture. Gone was the confident statesman who began the hearing with measured calm. In his place stood a man acutely aware that he was losing control of the room, and perhaps the story. He approached the microphone slowly but with purpose, and tapped the surface once, as if to reclaim command. His voice, when it came, was firmer than before, sharpened by calculation. "This law," he began, scanning the room without meeting any one gaze for too long, "does not apply to all students indiscriminately. It's designed for cases involving demonstrable risk, families where there is a clear pattern of harm, abuse, or neglect." He emphasized each word like he was building a fence, not to protect children, but to protect himself. His tone was clipped, bureaucratic, almost cold in its precision. There was no empathy in his delivery, just terms, categories, language that sounded safe on paper but sterile in real life. And then he turned to Jasmine. His voice shifted, took on that practiced tone of polite challenge, the kind used by career officials when addressing someone they intend to discredit without seeming hostile. "And with all due respect to the Congresswoman from Texas," he said, letting the title hang just long enough to signal distance, not honor, "I would caution this committee not to let emotionally charged anecdotes distort the purpose of this legislation. We are here to discuss policy, not isolated tragedies." It was sharp, surgical, a line delivered not for clarity, but for damage control, the kind of line that attempted to neutralize emotion by framing it as weakness. A tactic, and Jasmine knew it well. But she didn't flinch, she didn't recoil, she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she rose slowly, letting the silence expand just long enough to reclaim the air Ferguson had tried to dominate. One hand rested lightly on the edge of the table. The other lifted the microphone with deliberate calm. And when she spoke, her voice was steady. So steady, in fact, that it made the words that followed even more dangerous. "Facts without families," she said, eyes locked onto him with the force of someone who had seen what lived beyond the footnotes, "are just policies without people." It wasn't a counter-argument. It was a condemnation. A few in the chamber inhaled sharply. Others looked down, away, because everyone in that room, from the aides scribbling on legal pads to the lawmakers squirming behind their nameplates, knew exactly what she meant. You can cite numbers. You can recite protocols. But if the people behind those policies are crying in hospital waiting rooms, screaming behind voicemails, or buried beneath non-disclosure agreements, then what are we really defending? Ferguson didn't respond, not because he didn't have a rebuttal, but because there are moments in a room when language becomes irrelevant and only conscience remains. And in that moment, every eye in the room was on Jasmine Crockett, because she hadn't just defended her case. She had exposed what everyone else had been too afraid to name. The air in the chamber had changed. It wasn't just heavy anymore. It was charged, like a storm had rolled in and sealed the doors behind it. Jasmine Crockett could feel it in her ribs, in the way the walls no longer echoed with authority, but with something far more dangerous: conscience. And she was about to give it a voice it couldn't ignore. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into her leather briefcase, calm, composed, yet unmistakably deliberate. Every gesture was intentional now, stripped of flourish, built on precision. She placed a manila folder on the table in front of her and flipped it open slowly. What was inside was thin, only a few pages, but it might as well have been a lit fuse. Her eyes didn't leave the page as she spoke, her tone cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "These," she said, holding up the first sheet between her fingers, "are internal emails from a Seattle public middle school, acquired via a protected source, verified by independent counsel, dated March 3rd of this year. No one interrupted, no one dared. The senators, the aides, even the governor now looked at her not like a disruptor, but like a detonator. Jasmine continued. This first email was authored by the principal and sent to faculty and administrative staff. She paused for a breath, not to gather herself, but to let the silence build its own weight. Then she read, "Please do not involve parents regarding in-school medical interventions unless explicitly directed otherwise. Our goal is to provide a safe space without triggering unnecessary conflicts at home." She let the quote hang in the air like a dropped match in a dry forest. Gas flickered across the room. Not outrage. Not yet. What came first was recognition. It was the moment people realized something they hoped was isolated might be far more systemic. Jasmine knew that moment well. She'd spent her career tracing the roots of policies that called themselves compassionate while cutting families out at the knees. Her fingers moved to the next page. This one, sent just days later, contains an attached checklist distributed to school counselors. She held it up for the cameras to catch. A 2-column form labeled Student Concern, Discretion Required. On the right side, she said, you'll find a list of medical and psychological topics marked with a red star. Those are flagged for non-parental disclosure: puberty blockers, birth control, mental health referrals, self-harm disclosures, even hormone therapy consultations. Now it wasn't just the gasps, it was the shifting of chairs, the folding of arms, the kind of movement that happens when people aren't just surprised, they're cornered. Jasmine looked around the room. Understand, this is not in violation of the law Governor Ferguson signed. It's in compliance with it. These guidelines, these acts of exclusion, they were built on the foundation you gave them. She turned then, slowly, facing the man seated with practiced posture at the end of the long dais. The governor, Bob Ferguson, the architect, the signatory. Her voice didn't waver. If anything, it got quieter. Not from hesitation, but control. A calm so focused it became deadly. You didn't just sign a bill, she said, locking eyes with him. You activated a shadow system. That sentence didn't ring. It detonated. Because in that moment, everyone in the room understood the distinction. A law is passed in daylight, but a system is built in the dark. A system runs on the things no one puts in press releases. It lives in the soft directives, the unspoken memos, the whispered rules that never go before a vote. And that's exactly what Jasmine had exposed. She stepped forward from the desk, one page still in her hand. What this tells us, clearly, unambiguously, is that this isn't about emergency protections. This isn't a narrow safety valve for the truly endangered. This is a pipeline, a closed loop, and the ones being looped out of it are parents. Her voice gained intensity, not by volume, but by clarity. It's not about protecting kids from harm. It's about protecting institutions from parents. It's about control. And in every case where a child is struggling, every moment when a mother or father is sitting by a hospital bed asking what happened, that control becomes silence. That silence becomes policy. And that policy becomes suffering. She paused just for a breath. Her hands were steady, her eyes unflinching. This isn't some isolated case out of nowhere. This is Seattle, the beating heart of this state, the place where this legislation was born, and look what it's already become. She lifted the documents one last time, now with both hands, spreading them open for the press gallery to see. These emails didn't come from conspiracy theorists. They came from a whistleblower, a professional who could no longer sleep at night knowing what was happening under her own roof. And her words were simple. We were told to stop calling parents, so we did. Now even the lawmakers who had supported the bill were shifting in their seats, their expressions uncertain, some defensive, some shaken, all exposed. Jasmine turned back toward the audience, toward the families, the watchers, the citizens in the gallery who had traveled hours just to sit in silence and hope someone in that room would speak for them. She didn't offer them comfort. She offered them clarity. When parents are told they're too emotional, when stories of real harm are called anecdotes, when actual directives are buried under layers of language designed to shield institutions from accountability. We don't just lose policy, we lose trust. We lose the very bond between child and parent that holds society together. She stepped back, carefully placed the documents on the table, and looked one final time at Governor Ferguson. And you, she said, voice level, gave that system permission to grow. He didn't respond. His jaw was tight, his fingers interlocked tightly in front of him. Because what could he say? Deny the email? Call it fiction? He knew better. So did everyone else. For a long moment, the room was absolutely silent. The kind of silence that only follows revelation. The kind where people sit not just with what they've heard, but with what it now forces them to confront. Because after what Jasmine had just exposed, no one in that room could ever again say, "We didn't know." And that, more than anything, is what made the silence so terrifying. The silence following Jasmine's final words was so complete, so absolute, it almost felt staged. Like the entire room had been rehearsing for the moment, truth finally refused to be ignored. But no one spoke. No one moved. Not the lawmakers now visibly unsettled behind their microphones. Not the aides frantically scrolling through tablets looking for a defense that didn't exist. And not the governor, whose stillness had hardened into something almost brittle. Then came the gavel. One sharp, declarative tap. And the chairman's voice broke through the charged quiet. "We now invite 3 members of the public to speak," he said, "selected by lottery earlier this morning." There was a brief shuffle as a staffer walked toward the public seating, holding a printed list. He called out a name, and somewhere in the middle rows, a woman stood, mid-30s, wearing a denim jacket over a bright pride-striped shirt. Her hands shook slightly as she approached the podium, but her steps were firm, and her eyes didn't waver. She faced the room with the steadiness of someone who had waited years for a microphone and would not waste a second. "I'm a mother," she began, her voice strong, if tremulous at the edges, "and I support LGBTQ+ rights, not just because it's politically correct, but because my son is gay, and I love him. I will fight for his dignity until my last breath." She paused, inhaled deeply, and her voice shifted, tighter, more raw. "But let me be clear about something else." She looked straight at the governor, then around at the lawmakers, who now seemed unsure of whether to meet her gaze or look away. "I support LGBTQ+ kids, but my right to be a mother doesn't end where the government's opinion begins." The room tensed again, not with resistance but recognition. "I support LGBTQ+ rights, but my right to be a mother is not something this state has the authority to erase." She stepped back without waiting for applause. There wasn't any. There didn't need to be. Her words didn't land like a speech. They landed like a line drawn in concrete. The chairman called the next name. This time it was a man, tall, mid-40s, in work boots and a dark windbreaker, with his union patch on the chest. He stepped forward like a man used to defending his family not in chambers, but on job sites and picket lines. He adjusted the mic with calloused hands and gave no preamble. "My name's Adam. I've got 2 kids in public schools. One of them's 12. His jaw worked a second, fighting something back. "And I'm not a politician. I'm not a church guy. I don't go to rallies. Hell, I voted for half the people in this room." Then he straightened. His voice dropped in tone but gained force. "I'm not conservative. I'm not liberal. But I'll tell you this. I have the right to know if someone's putting something in my kid's body." That line hit the back wall of the chamber like it had been fired from a cannon. "You don't get to sideline me because you're afraid of how I'll react. You don't get to decide I'm a danger just because I still believe parents have a role." He looked down for a breath, then back up, his tone quieter but far more dangerous. "You think I'm unreasonable? You think I'm the problem? You ever sat next to your kid and wondered what's going on in their bloodstream? You ever had to explain to your wife why the school never called?" He leaned slightly into the mic. "If this system treats me like a threat for asking questions, then maybe it's the system that's broken." He stepped back. Silence followed him like a shadow. The final speaker called was a woman in her 60s. Her silver hair was pinned tightly in a bun, and she wore a blazer with a school PTA pin fastened near the collar. She walked slowly, but with dignity, And when she reached the podium, she took a long pause before speaking. Her voice was softer, not weak, but weighted with experience. It was the kind of voice that made people lean in. I've been an educator, I've been a parent, and now I'm a grandparent. I've watched this system evolve, and not always for the better. She looked around, locking eyes with several lawmakers. This hearing, it's not about politics, it's not about slogans, it's about a simple question. She pointed toward the raised panel. Do you trust families, or don't you? A beat of silence. She continued slower now. Because if you don't, then stop pretending this is about safety. Stop dressing it up in terms like compassion and modernity. Just say it plainly. You don't trust us. You don't believe we'll understand. You don't believe we'll act in love. She steadied her voice once more. But I promise you this. I've raised 3 kids, and I have never needed a state agency to tell me when they were hurting. I just needed the truth. Then she leaned in, voice barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than anything that had come before. You can't protect children by making parents the enemy. And with that, she stepped back and returned to her seat. For a moment, no one spoke, but the silence this time wasn't uncertain. It was shifting, because one by one, slowly, subtly, visibly, lawmakers began to shift in their chairs. A senator from the Eastern District nodded, almost involuntarily. Another leaned over to whisper something to his aide. Others looked toward the governor, but this time not for leadership. They were reading the temperature, and it had changed. Something fundamental had moved in the room. Not because the speeches were loud, not because they were polished, but because they were real. Because in that brief window of truth-telling, the hearing stopped being about ideology and started being about pain. And no statistic, no legal defense, no firewall of expert reports could undo the sound of 3 ordinary voices saying what everyone else was too afraid to say. We're not trying to control you. We're just trying to be allowed to care. The room had shifted, not just in posture or policy or political alignment, something deeper. Like tectonic plates beneath marble floors, realignment was happening beneath the surface. You could feel it in the way senators glanced sideways instead of forward, in the stiff silence of aides no longer whispering, in the twitch of a jaw, the rub of a temple. But the most visible change was in the people, the ones in the back rows, in denim and flannel, in work boots and scarves. They had come as observers. Now they sat like witnesses. And Jasmine Crockett knew it was time. She didn't rise with urgency. She rose with purpose, like a final card had been played, and the only thing left was truth. She took a moment to collect a single sheet of paper from her binder, unfolded it cleanly, and raised it just high enough that the seal at the top, the eagle and torch of the United States Department of Education, was visible to every camera in the room. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. It was low, measured, clear, and that made it hit harder. This is a federal study, she began, holding the paper steady in her left hand, published by the Department of Education in conjunction with the CDC. It surveyed over 50,000 students in public middle and high schools across the country, including here in Washington. No one looked away, not even those who'd been avoiding eye contact all morning. She continued, 67% of students reported hiding mental health issues from their parents out of fear, shame, or uncertainty. But over 80% of those same students later said they wished their parents had known sooner. She let the sentence breathe, let it settle like dust over glass, revealing what had been invisible only moments before. The number wasn't abstract. It had names. It had faces. It had the sound of teenagers sitting alone in bedrooms, staring at screens, crying quietly behind closed doors. And it had the silence of parents downstairs, unaware, excluded, made irrelevant not because they didn't love their children, but because the system had decided they weren't needed. Jasmine lowered the paper, gently folding it again before speaking. We've heard a lot today about protection, about safety, about giving children space to be who they are. Her voice never lost control, but it took on weight now, the kind that filled the space between the facts. But what do we do when the system meant to protect starts to divide? When it puts children in one room and their parents in another and locks the door between them? No one answered. No one needed to. She took one small step forward. She wasn't behind the table now. She was standing in the open space between power and truth. I am asking this council not to repeal the law entirely, she said, her tone firm but not confrontational, but to amend it, to restore one essential clause, that fit, loving, non-abusive parents must be included in decisions that affect the bodies and minds of their children. That medical intervention without notification must never be default. That discretion is not license for secrecy. The silence in the room was no longer fearful. It was reverent. Because for the first time in the hearing, this wasn't about factions. It wasn't about left or right. It was about restoring the most basic relationship in human existence, the bond between a parent and their child, from the edge of legal erasure. Jasmine looked not at the lawmakers now, but directly at the cameras, at the millions watching across the state, across the country. I am not fighting to give rights to bad parents. I am fighting to ensure no one is treated like a criminal, simply for trying to protect their child. Her final words didn't echo. They landed, they stayed. She said them not as a warning, not even as an accusation, but as a promise. And in that moment, on that floor, in that chamber, in that fight, no one doubted she meant every word. And when Jasmine's final words fell into the charged silence, it was as if the room forgot how to breathe. No applause, no rebuttal, no movement. Just stillness. The kind that follows the collapse of a structure no one wanted to admit was crumbling. The chairman sat frozen for a beat, lips parted, pen motionless above his notepad. A moment passed, then another. Finally, he shifted forward, cleared his throat with a sharp intake of breath, and tapped his gavel once. A hollow sound in a chamber now stripped of noise and pretense. The committee, he announced, voice tight, deliberate, will recess for review. We will hold a private vote within 48 hours to determine the future of House Bill 1139. He paused, then added with almost mechanical formality, "The hearing is adjourned." The words fell like a stone into still water, and then the room exhaled. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled, reporters sprang to life like detonated drones, phones lifted, live streams resumed. But in the midst of all the noise, the cameras locked in on one man, the architect of the bill, the most powerful political figure in the room only an hour earlier. Governor Bob Ferguson. The lens zoomed slowly, mercilessly, until his face filled the screen. He didn't speak. For the first time that day, maybe the first time in weeks, he said nothing. His jaw was tight, nostrils flared, brow furrowed. But it wasn't the expression of a man preparing a counterattack. It was the face of someone doing a calculus he had never imagined needing to do. What if the room has already turned? What if the crowd outside isn't noise but prophecy? He didn't flinch when Jasmine stood to leave. He didn't look up when one of his aides whispered something hurried in his ear. He just sat there, staring at the far wall like it might suddenly split open and offer a way out that didn't involve retreat. But outside, there was no escape. The moment Jasmine stepped through the massive brass doors of Olympia City Hall, the rain greeted her like thunder without sound. Steady, cold, and indifferent to politics. A gust of wind lifted her coat slightly as she stepped out onto the top of the wide stone steps, and for a single second, the entire crowd seemed to freeze. Hundreds of people had gathered there. Most had no idea how long they'd been standing. Some had umbrellas. Others were soaked to the skin. But none of them were leaving. They had watched every minute of the hearing on the giant screen propped against a support van from Como News, and they had waited. Not for the vote, but for her. Jasmine stood at the top of the steps, shoulders square, spine straight, rain pooling on her lashes. She didn't raise her hand, didn't wave, didn't speak. She didn't have to, because from the crowd, somewhere near the middle, from a voice half choked with emotion, came a cry. "Let parents know." Another voice joined, then 5, then 20, then hundreds. "Let parents know. Let parents know. Let parents know." The chant rolled over the stone plaza like a wave of thunder returning to claim the sky. Drivers passing on Capitol Way slowed to honk their horns in unison. A line of soaked students standing beneath the arches of the Legislative Annex lifted hand-painted signs that read, "Transparency is not a threat," and "I trust my mom." Inside the building, through the thick glass windows on the third floor, several lawmakers stood side by side watching. They didn't speak, not yet, but their eyes no longer held the shield of certainty. Down on the steps, Jasmine finally moved, slowly descending into the storm of chants and cameras and people. And those staffers urged her to return to the vehicle, she shook her head once, stepped forward, and stopped in front of the barricade. One father, the same man who had broken down inside the chamber, now drenched and red-eyed, stepped to the front of the crowd. She met his gaze. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to, because in that space between them, in the breath they shared, the battle had already spoken louder than gratitude. Behind them, the rain kept falling, but no one moved. Not yet. Not until the vote. Not until someone finally answered the question that had pierced the walls of Olympia and echoed across the country. If the government doesn't trust parents to love their own children, who will be next to vanish behind the curtain of policy? And as the chants echoed across the wet stone steps of the Capitol, as cameras zoomed in and protest signs rose like a forest of defiance, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't even about legislation. It was about something older than the law, deeper than policy, and more powerful than partisanship. It was about the right to be a parent in a world that keeps trying to replace you with systems, protocols, and silence. Because in that moment, when Jasmine Crockett stood still in the storm, when 1,000 voices roared the same four words into the bone-chilled air, a line was drawn between what governance is supposed to do and what it's actually doing. The lesson wasn't wrapped in statistics. It wasn't buried in footnotes. It stood in the rain, dripping, furious, alive. And the lesson was this: when a government becomes more comfortable with secrets than with trust, it stops being a guardian. It becomes a gatekeeper. And those gates, they're often closed to the very people who are willing to fight hardest for the ones inside. Jasmine Crockett learned this not from a briefing, not from a court opinion, but from watching a father weep in a courtroom because he found out 2 days too late that someone had touched his child without ever calling his name. She learned it from a mother who supported LGBTQ rights with her whole chest, and yet was treated like an obstacle to her own child's well-being. She learned it from families across America who are told they're too emotional to be involved, while bureaucrats sign off on choices that no one ever has to explain. That is not protection, that is erasure. And in a society that talks endlessly about inclusion, it is the cruelest irony of all to claim you're saving children by cutting out the very people who raise them. So what is the lesson? The lesson is that real justice requires proximity. You cannot protect a child from across a spreadsheet. You cannot love a child through legal distance. And you cannot build a healthy future if you treat every parent like a liability instead of a partner. Because here's the truth that no one in power wanted to say on record, but everyone in that hearing room felt by the time Jasmine Crockett sat down: policy without people is just paperwork. Compassion without accountability is just branding. And protection without transparency is just control in disguise. The law they debated wasn't the enemy. It was the mask. The enemy was the belief that systems work better when people are kept in the dark. That's why Jasmine's final words didn't just land. They ruptured. I am not fighting to give rights to bad parents. I am fighting to ensure no one is treated like a criminal simply for trying to protect their child. Because that's what had been happening. That's what is happening. Parents who ask questions are labeled threats. Parents who push back are called ignorant. Parents who demand to be informed are told it's none of their business. But children don't belong to institutions. They don't belong to school boards. They don't belong to state frameworks. They belong to the people who hold them at 3 a.m. when they're vomiting, to the ones who take off work to sit through testing results, to the ones who carry the weight of the consequences long after the system moves on to its next pilot program. And in that courtroom, Jasmine wasn't just defending parental rights. She was defending the human soul of accountability. Because if we are to survive the age of policy without heart, of AI with no ethics, of institutions built to streamline humanity into boxes, then we must reclaim something simple but terrifying to power. The right to ask, the right to be told, the right to matter. That's what this fight was really about. Not hormones, not religion, not left or right, but about whether the truth is a right or a reward handed out by the state. And Jasmine Crockett had decided that no one should have to earn the right to love their child. That truth has cost her public scorn, political backlash, the smirking dismissal of men in press suits who believe the only valid trauma is one that fits into policy briefs. But she kept showing up, not because she wanted the fight, but because she couldn't live with herself if she walked away from it. And now others were standing too, because a woman in a soaked denim jacket had reminded a nation that identity and motherhood are not enemies. Because a construction worker who never wanted to be political had spoken like a man testifying for the right to stay in his own child's story. Because a grandmother had asked one question so piercing in its simplicity that the whole chamber had to look away. Do you trust families or don't you? The vote hadn't happened yet, but the tide had already turned. And whether the law changed tomorrow or next session or 10 sessions from now, something irreversible had occurred. A system had been seen, its mask had slipped, and the people it erased had refused to be silent. That's what Jasmine Crockett gave this country. Not a perfect solution, not a flawless argument, but something far more dangerous to those who hide behind protocol. She gave them a reckoning, and with it, a lesson the entire nation had to learn the hard way. You cannot build a just society by deleting the people who love hardest, feel deepest, and show up first when a child cries out for help. Because that is not progress. That is betrayal. And that betrayal, it ends now. But lessons mean nothing if they don't lead to movement. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand in that storm just to make a point. She stood there to make a promise. And now it's our turn to decide if her voice echoes into change or drowns in silence. Because laws don't change because they're wrong. They change because people refuse to obey their silence. They change because we decide they no longer get to define what justice looks like without us at the table. So here's the question. If you felt something when that father wept in front of the world, if you clenched your fists when Jasmine read those emails, if your chest tightened when the chant, "Let parents know," shook the foundation of Olympia's marble steps, then what are you going to do about it? This is not a spectator moment. This is a line in the sand moment. The people who created this law are counting on fatigue. They are counting on headlines to fade, on protesters to go home, on votes to be buried beneath layers of procedure. Don't let them. Call your representative, email the committee, show up to the school board, demand a clause that requires transparency when it comes to your children. Demand accountability when your trust is discarded. Demand that the government stop treating you like a liability in your own child's life. And if they don't listen, replace them. Every name behind this bill sits in an office that you, the people, gave them. And you can take it back. This isn't about party, it's about power. And right now, that power belongs to those brave enough to raise their voice. Not once, but over and over, until the law reflects what the people already know. Secrecy is not safety. Erasure is not protection. Silence is not consent. The next 48 hours are critical. They will either write history or rewrite your rights, but only if you act, not tomorrow. Now, because if Jasmine Crockett stood in that hearing and cracked the system wide open, the only question left is this. Will you finish what she started? And if your answer is yes, then don't whisper. Roar. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.